Okay, so this week I wanted to kind of do something different again, despite the fact that this is under the Versus label or whatever you want to call it. This is just more so kind of sort of going through the Gus Van Sant Death trilogy as opposed to necessarily pitting them against each other or something like that. Just kind of a general, just kind of generally talking about the three of them and how they relate and all that other stuff. Um, and with it being considered called the Death Trilogy, I actually heard once that not only are they connected by the idea that obviously they're all three are stories that seem kind of like they may be aimless or like they're leading to something, and then ultimately, obviously, are punctuated by death just before they end. But more specifically, that it's specifying death by one's best friend, which makes sense for two of them technically, because obviously the way Jerry ends, and despite all the death and Elephant, Alex killing Eric, but that leads some interesting openings for Last Days. Interesting if vague. So I'm not sure I've ever heard Gus Van Sant say that personally, but the great thing about it is that it also just feels like more of just an approach to death in general, and not necessarily that specific, given that all the deaths are not only in entirely different ways, but for entirely different reasons, with entirely different things leading up to them. So I just kind of took it as more of a kind of a general exploration and portrayal of death, however you want to view it. There's many ways to do that. Um, I was thinking for a while that technically Paranoid Park might also fit into this, since I believe it was his next one after Last Days, and it sort of kind of fits the same kind of ideas, but I do think, all in all, it is a bit more, it's not as calm, it's not as quiet, so it maybe not necessarily doesn't fit in that way, and also, just the idea of it being a trilogy. Like, there was, a Robert Zemeckis quote recently about trilogies, basically saying, in a nutshell, that trilogies are basically so definitive because they more or less align with the whole three-act structure, so trilogies should just kind of be trilogies if they're going to, so all of that makes perfect sense. Also, these three movies are based, well, not based, but supposedly inspired by, obviously, real-life events, like, Jerry apparently was based off a real story about, just vaguely about two dudes that go into the desert, and one of them ended up killing the other before one of them got out. And this was a story that Matt Damon had told Gus Van Sant, and that was when they basically got the idea to make the movie. But Gus Van Sant said that he did not want to tell that story. He was just inspired to pretty much tell a story that resulted in the same way, with the same setup, but still an entire piece of fiction, sort of like, just like you could technically say that Jerry is totally not that story, Elephant is totally not Columbine, Michael Pitt in Last Days is totally not Kurt Cobain. That one's a bit more forward about that, but still. So, yeah, now let's just kind of go into these one at a time, I guess. This is the way that I own Jerry. This is like this six-pack of just thrillers from Miramax that Jerry just happens to be in. And so that's how I saw that for the first time, and I've seen it a couple of times since. And when I talk about Jerry, you may have to forgive me for if I overuse the word surreal by accident, because that's just generally what comes to mind right away. Now, as we start off, there is the first thing that catches your attention is that it feels like there's like no start, like there's no credits or anything like that. It's just like a blue screen that's up there for a little bit, and then it goes right into 5.5 minutes of Matt Damon and Casey Affleck driving out into the desert, supposedly looking for something that I believe is ultimately something we never learn, because it doesn't matter. It's just the reason they need to get out there. And in this 5.5 minutes of just Casey Affleck driving them through the desert, you will notice not only does it kind of feel like, in general, if you know what the setup is, that it's like this is the start of them just gradually getting more and more out into the middle of nowhere, which is ultimately what the rest of the movie is going to be in a different way, but with different kind of connotations to doom and all that. But it's also, you notice real quick that Van Sant has not been shy about the fact that when he made these movies, particularly Gerry, that he was inspired by Bellatar quite a bit. And if you're familiar with his work, you will know that he's known for very long takes, like at times excruciatingly long takes. And you can totally feel that inspiration here, and it does work effectively for sure. It just kind of fits Van Sant's style in a really nice way that I maybe wouldn't have thought about seeing his movies prior to this, but it really does come together nicely with that kind of inspiration. I think I read somewhere that there's like, it's so precise that there's like exactly 100 shots in the whole movie. Um, so there is something to this because this is easily a movie where you often have those movies, especially like really artsy ones or whatever, that are usually accused of being pretentious or nothing happens movies. And honestly, if somebody were to say they watched Gerry and they hated it because nothing happens, I wouldn't argue with them. I might tell them, I might go through the bullet points or whatever I'm about to talk about now, but I wouldn't necessarily immediately think that they have a wrong opinion or anything like that. It's very easy to understand the negative, what negative reactions this movie did get. But the interesting thing about it, though, is when you think about the nothing happens idea of going into this, it actually, in regards to what sets the events of the movie off, or lack of events, whatever you want to say, feels like it happens very quickly. Like, if you were to be told that the story is they go out into the desert, they're looking for something, they don't find it, and on their way back to the car, they end up getting lost. And you know that it's the takes are very long, and it's a lot of just walking in silence. You would think that, like, maybe half the movie is them going out there, and then the other half is them getting lost. It's about 100 minutes, I think, an hour 40 or so, to match the number of shots, of course. But the thing here is that it happens quite quickly. It's maybe like 12 minutes in. They realize that they're out here for nothing. So it actually almost feels like immediate in regards to what the movie is actually about, if you want to call it that. So that I always found that kind of interesting, actually, despite the fact that the movie feels so slow. How quickly what comes into play does. And yeah, like I was saying, there's a very surreal quality to it. There's a lot of moments that feel almost dreamlike, like the really long ordeal of Casey Affleck being on top of the rock. And it's like, we have no idea how he got up there. He apparently has no idea how he got up there, and he has no idea how he's going to get back down. And it's like, that's one of those things that you would imagine like happening in a dream, when you just, in dreams where you just kind of start in a place and you just have no recollection of how you started there, and then it's just a matter of where you're going to go from there. It's a scene that feels like it's built entirely around that kind of thing, which is very interesting. And then there's also other shots, like the very long shot of them from the side, just kind of walking along. And for a while there, it seems there's something almost off about it. Because, not just for how long it lasts, but the fact of where it's just the sound effects of them walking through the sand, and it's just like them from kind of here up, and we're just watching them walk from a side shot that goes on for seemingly forever. But there's little things in here that just make it feel really off, like the fact that for a while they're walking in like perfect unison, which is a little weird. But then and the thing about it is that this has obviously been going on for a while, and they're in the middle of the desert. But in this shot that's kind of up close to them, they don't appear to be tired. They don't appear to be breaking a sweat. It's a lot of the times their mouths are closed, which for some reason is just kind of weird to me when you think of walking a great distance. And it's, yeah, but then once they get out of unison, it's almost like watching them walk, it kind of almost makes them look like the gears of a machine or something. And it's like this, just kind of another way of feeling like, this ever-going thing of just going further and further into the forgotten abyss or whatever to get just more and more lost than they are. And it just the way that keeps going and going and going. It feels like it's an eternity. I think the shot's maybe like 3 minutes or something, but it feels so much longer. Yet somehow that's not really a complaint. Anyway, but there's also and then there's kind of a nice counter to that also, to like them seeming like this machine that just keeps going and going, is the shot when it's like from behind and it's their silhouettes, and you can just tell that they're like really worn down. They're still walking, but they're like barely moving, and Affleck's like way behind. And the more it goes on, the greater the shot gets, because they like slowly come into the light. And it's this really great shot as we see them like finally winding down and getting to that point to where they're just breaking. So I thought that was really well handled. And another thing in regards to... This is also kind of a counter to the idea that I said that for the kind of movie that it starts quickly. It's the whole thing where once they get lost, like once they realize that they're lost, it's like it does not set in quickly. Like most of the time you would think that by sundown they would be like super frantic. It would be like basically the way it is at the end of the movie. But they get through the first day like just kind of bullshitting and talking about Wheel of Fortune. And like they don't seem that bothered right away that they're totally lost. That this could be a potentially deadly situation. And it's like almost like they kind of embrace it a little bit, which is really interesting. But then yes, we do see their gradual descent into hopelessness. We see them like... There's the shot where they're like trying to like desperately piece together where they are, and we get like images are cut into that of like the road, and it's like the road is now this thing that feels almost like... It almost feels like mythical. It almost feels like something so far away, like it almost starts to feel at worst non-existent altogether at this point, which is a really great way to portray that sort of like lost and hopelessness and all that. Another thing really important in this movie is like the location and the use of that, and how it's kind of... It plays an important part in feeling like the movie keeps going, because we have all these different landscapes. Like we've got hills and we've got like rock formations. Sometimes it's like perfectly flat. There's the scene when they're like the wind's blowing really hard and they're going towards like a darkness, and it's like it feels like another place entirely than the desert itself. And it's like every single location, despite the fact that it's just desert, somehow finds a way to feel like different in every new scene. And sometimes it avoids backgrounds altogether. Like I was talking about, there's a lot of scenes like when they're getting more and more desperate, or when we're just watching them walk from the side, where their faces more or less are just the shots like entirely. Like there's hardly anything else there. So that's a way that really kind of keeps it, to me, from feeling too redundant. I'm sure maybe it gets there a few times a little bit, but overall, I've always kind of liked the flow of it. It never quite feels as long as it is when I watch it anyway. So, but then of course we do get to the inevitable moment of Damon killing Affleck, and the way it comes about is that it seems to play up like it's a mercy killing, because Affleck's laying there and he's the one that... It always seemed like he was going to be the one that cracked first. He was the one that was falling behind, and he's like laying there talking about like leaving or something. And so, yeah, but then there's always kind of been something in the back of my head that's like, what if it wasn't a mercy killing? What if it was like... What if there was a... Maybe not necessarily malicious, but just obviously Damon reaching a snapping point. Because you'll notice throughout the movie, at least as far as I remember, I feel like Affleck is the one that talks the most. Like, Affleck's the one that's usually kind of rambling a little bit, and so it's like, even in like these moments where he feels like he's leaving his body, Affleck is like still talking. I can just imagine Damon's character just like losing it, just not wanting to hear his voice anymore in this moment. But that's just something that has run through my head. But it more or less, I've always taken it as a mercy killing. But I do like that it kind of leaves... it's sudden and ambiguous enough that you can question that. Then obviously there's the inevitable, as soon as he is killed, Affleck, help arrives. And it's like, whenever I think about this, and whenever I hear, like, when people talk about the ending of The Mist, for instance, the first thing I always think of is, you haven't seen Gerry, have you? It's like, something came a little before The Mist, that captured, kind of the oh fuck of that ending, so, yeah, so overall, like I said, I do understand where people come from when they say, what the hell is this? What's the point of this? Is it saying anything? Why is it so slow? Why is hardly anything happening? Whatever. Yeah, I do get that, but there has always been something that's just been really kind of intriguing to me and really surreal about it. That's just really engaging. And it's... And yeah, I would say their performances have a little to do with it, but surprisingly, good of actors as they are and convincing as they are in the movie, it's really just kind of like the way Van Sant tells the story, and cinematography certainly, that kind of tells the story in almost a silent way, in a way to where that everything kind of around them stands out just as much, if not more, than them themselves. Despite the fact that they do have to portray that hopelessness, and they do it very well and very effectively, but yeah, so that's how I feel about Gerry. As I increasingly grow intimidated, let's move on to the second movie in the trilogy, which is Elephant. And the reason I say intimidated is because this is a movie I've kind of been adamant about talking about for a long time. It's just kind of been put off for a number of reasons, but one of which is that honestly, it's one of my favorite movies ever, and there's just so much to it and so much to talk about that it just kind of... Yeah, it just kind of became overwhelming, so I've been a bit nervous to actually try to go into it, and basically in the sense that maybe I won't do it justice is my fear. So let's go into it now and see what we come up with. For starters, it had a very nice trip to Cannes back in 2003, where not only did it win the Palm, but it also got Van Sant Best Director. And the interesting approach that it takes here is this obviously just on the surface, it's known for its very realistic depiction of high school life, particularly in this one day within the span of what can't be that big of a portion of the day. Everything kind of kicks off so early in the morning, but the way the story's told, with all of the kind of intersecting lives, more or less, really gives us an interesting kind of unique view that we may not be expecting when we go into this, if we just know what the setup is, let alone what the outcome is. But talking about that, one of the things that makes that so interesting is that we start off with the character John, who I assume is kind of, like he gets his face on the poster, he's the starting point of the movie. I guess because when you look at it, there are people who definitely... Like, when you look at it realistically, it's kind of like high school isn't necessarily as, like, cliquey or just broken up into certain places and has certain types as much as depicted in, say, the movies or something. Though that can sometimes exist. But the people that don't really get too much attention in those kind of movies are people like John, who are probably the most common in real life, which is the guy that's just kind of neutral. The guy that doesn't necessarily fit in anywhere in a particular group, and seems to more or less get along with pretty much anybody. And the interesting thing that we see here is he's obviously going through some things where we see, like, his dad is obviously drunk this early in the morning, and this seems to be a common occurrence. And he just goes into a room, and he seems all cool and collected, but then there's that one moment where he just kind of goes into the room and tries to subtly break down, and then you realize that even though he's probably just a face that people pass in the hall many times a day, not necessarily all these people are going to have this glimpse of him. And the way that the movie is set up to where stuff like this intersects is it gives us that idea about everybody. everybody in the movie, even the people that the camera never focuses on that are just in the background, all have a story like John's, or like Carrie's got the whole she might be potentially pregnant thing that they kind of just say in passing. And it really sets up that vibe that anybody you see in passing in like a school-like environment is going to have their own thing going on, and that's kind of what I feel like is the main setup with this whole way they come in and out of each other's lives as the movie goes on, and a lot of the times the same moments. And they do a really great job at establishing like the familiarity. Like, not one of the big reasons is, or one of the big ways they do this is that every actor in the movie goes by their own actual name, with the exception of like the veterans like Timothy Bottoms and Matt Malloy, obviously as John's dad and the principal, respectively. But yeah, all the kids in the movie go by their actual real life names, which really adds this kind of eerily realistic quality to it. But then there's also scenes like, when I say familiarity, like not just like us being able to relate to just them going through this mundane, school day or whatever, but when you see the scene many times, like when John and Eli run into each other in the hallway, and it's like the way they just kind of approach each other and just start talking, it's like they've been set up enough to where we haven't seen like a lot of them or know too much about them, but the second we see John and Eli interact, it's kind of like, yeah, you immediately feel like these are two guys that would know each other, just from the little bits we've gotten of them up to this point. So that kind of familiarity really kind of adds to the realism also. And it's interesting to watch them, because I was talking about the way they kind of, some of them are broken up into their sort of like, their social placement in this school. And it's also not just kind of watching them sort of live through this day, just kind of, normally, like watching them, observing them in their natural habitat, but kind of seeing exactly, almost like a response to being in whatever social placement they happen to be in. One that particularly comes to mind is Michelle, the kind of weird girl that has like troubles in gym and all that, and just seems like this real outcast. But the thing is it's like that also sets up that these not only is not every character one-dimensional just because they have a certain placement or whatever that they're given socially, but that placement doesn't necessarily mean one thing. Like, Michelle is an outcast in one way, and clearly, obviously, Alex is an outcast in another way, and it sort of makes you think, you kind of watch Michelle go through this, just these scenes where she, like, hardly says anything at all, and there's, like, one scene, like, really in passing just before it cuts off, where she's called a loser in the locker room. And it's like, and she just goes about it just really quietly, and we don't really, get to see inside her head or anything, but we just kind of watch her go through it, and we start to realize that in another universe, she could have been an Alex. Like, she could have related to this in a totally different way, as we see with Alex. So I sort of like how they kind of find a similar type, but then say these things can go in two totally different directions and create two totally different people. Yeah, you could probably put them in the same category, technically, at least pre the final events of the movie. And speaking of the final events of the movie, one of the great things that it really does, I keep forgetting how early this happens in the movie every time I watch it, because I'm always like, oh yeah, we're already to this point. And that is the moment when John witnesses Alex and Eric going into the school with their guns. And from that point on, the brilliant thing that the movie does is it sets up tension while keeping the sort of mundane attitude towards high school life that it's had up to this point. Because we go, after that's shown to us, we know what it means, but then we go right back to the style that we've been doing, where we just watch these individual characters introduced with their own title cards and everything. But because we know when that moment is, and because the way the movie is so brilliantly structured and edited by Van Sant, by the way, we always sense when that moment is coming, but the scenes always end just when it looks like shit's about to go down, so we're always anticipating when that's happened. Like, the first time we see John and Eli run into each other in the hallway, and then we follow John, and then that's where we know that's when he sees them, and that's when they're coming in. So we see different scenes that we know are leading directly to that moment when John sees them, but just before it seems like they get into the building, we go back and we see somebody else's, and it's just, so we're always kind of just constantly tensely waiting for that build up, despite the fact that we're still watching kind of the mundane part of it, which is just really brilliantly done. So then it goes into exactly how the characters are affected by the events, like how we kind of view them knowing what's coming. Like, there are two different ways you view this movie. There's the first time you see it, when it just looks like you're watching, like if you don't know what the setup is, which I didn't the first time I saw it, you're kind of just expecting it to be, oh, so this is what this is, just, a day in the life of high school or whatever, and then it may come to a point, it may not. But then the second time you watch it, and the many times I've lost track of how many times I've seen this movie, but you see it in such a different way because you realize you're watching all these people, like every single mundane moment with these people seems significant because it's either their last moments or leading up to their last moments, or even if they are somebody that survives, this is something that's going to change them forever. Just having been there and witnessed it and knowing, probably, there's so many victims in the movie, surely all of them knew somebody, like you can connect somebody to somebody in any way, so anybody's going to be directly affected by this, whether they were killed or not. And the interesting thing about that is that it's kind of hard to say, talk about this without kind of going into more current things, but it's like, the way we're witnessing that horror, where I was talking about how it feels so real and familiar just watching, high school life, but then that also brings on the horror of the familiarity and realism of the more horrific aspect of the movie in the last portion. And it's like, and the way that becomes a reality to them as it's become a reality to, like, so many people lately, whether that be, kids, parents, or teachers, once again, whether they've been killed or whether they suffer the fate of having been connected to somebody that was killed, or, like I said, just having it in this vicinity that they are so familiar with in general, that's been a part of their life. All these characters are not going to be the same one way or the other after this. And so all that build-up we see leading up to those moments, it's like you're just watching these people who are about to be altered significantly. And it just adds a whole other layer to it when you see it over and over again. And there's even, like, I particularly like the illustration of this when there's one moment in the movie of slow-mo. And of course it's when we're following John, and it's like, this seems to be the moment where that really just kind of really pinpoints that, but in a really subtle way. When John is playing with the dog outside and we see Alex and Eric coming, and it goes into slow-mo for like just a minute as he's playing with that dog. And it's like there's this brief moment of bliss with this dog that he has, and it's really narrowing in on that. And then that's when we realize that this moment with the dog is like the last moment, the very last moment that John had before this life-changing event is about to happen. Like I said, he's not inside, he doesn't get harmed, but once again, no matter where you stand, this is life-altering for anybody involved, and they show this through John, I feel like, with that moment. So, and it shows, like, just how quickly you can go from everything's normal to everything's not. Like, you're playing with a dog 1 second, and the next second you're witnessing something like this. So I thought that was really well done also. And the way they kind of, and in talking about the fact that it's their last moments, I really like the way the structure just kind of carries that out to the point that, like, when we talk about seeing these characters in their last moments, we're like that's not even close to an exaggeration, because you have the way that sort of everything comes back around. Like when we have the moment when John goes into the principal's office at the very beginning, and then it cuts to Michelle on the field. But this shot of Michelle on the field that seems surrounding her actually ends with us following Nathan without a cut all the way in, and that also introduces Carrie, and then and we just go through this whole thing, and then there's the intersecting when John goes in and is talking about the picture, and Nathan goes in looking to sign out, and we see this, like, we see it, and then we see it again, like, 10 seconds just before it happened. And so it's like, it feels like we're seeing every single moment without missing anything from all the characters we're introduced to. And that especially just really drives that whole thing. And then talking about characters that sort of come into it, there is, like, when we see Benny, for instance, the way the movie kind of really basically kills any expectation you might have, where Benny almost seems like kind of a seed that's planted, because I think we see him around at least a couple times. I'm pretty sure he's on that scene in the field where we're introduced to Michelle and then Nathan. And it's sort of like, you kind of get a sense that it's building to something. And then finally, at the very end, in the middle of the carnage, we get the formal introduction of Benny, including his name card and all that, over the black background. And they set it up like it's gonna be, like, maybe this guy will be the one that, like, saves the day or something. We see it, like, we do see him do a little of that when he helps the girl that likes John out the window to safety. And then when he walks around, there's just something so, like, stoic and fearless about him. And it sort of gives you this calm, like there might be hope. And then just completely like that, Eric kills him. Like he's nothing. And that really kind of shows you, like I said, really grounds you in the realism as well, to where it's like, in situations like this, it's not going to be very movie-like. Like, anybody, even if they seem like the one that's going to be the hero, just anybody is expendable in the eyes of people like Alex and Eric and all that, and that's the really terrifying thing about it. So I really like that. I suppose it could be seen as a bit of sort of a bit manipulative in a really obvious way. But I think overall it really does work when you kind of look at it more so from that kind of perspective. And so, of course, you think about what exactly is it that Van Sant wants to say with this movie. Because obviously, you know, it's a response to Columbine and all that, but it doesn't really have an interest, it seems, in finding a reason for why it happened. That's not the kind of movie that it is. That's not the kind of portrayal that it is. It's basically just this is what happened. This is exactly, you know, obviously not exactly as, like, the real events played out, but this event in the movie, this is just how it played out, and that's the way it is. The reason doesn't really come into play in regards to this portrayal of it. And I would think the main reason it wouldn't be interested in trying to find a reason is the fact that there's just always going to be a why factor. Because there's, like, I mean, you look at it like, you know, why would Alex and Eric do this? And obviously, the obvious assumption is the bullying that we witness, not just of Alex, but when Benny's approaching Eric, if you listen closely and you have, like, the subtitles on, you can see that when he's talking to the principal, he's basically saying, like, when people come to you when they're being picked on, maybe you'll pay more close attention now. So obviously Eric has been through just as much as Alex has. And some stuff we don't know about, like when he says, when he talks about this kid named Jared, when Eric's talking to the principal, it's like, we don't know who the fuck Jared is. We've never met Jared, I don't think. But we do get a sense that Eric also has a history of just whatever built up to this in the way that we saw it much more vividly with Alex, even though we still don't really see it that vividly with Alex either. So it's like that leads you to always be thinking, like, you know, was it the bullying? Was the bullying the last straw? Was it something before that? To where it's like when we see him get frustrated with the piano music, it's like maybe one day, the straw that broke the camel's back was he didn't get the music right, and then he started hatching the plan. And it's like, we never really know for sure. And then it's like, and we see the scene in the cafeteria where it's basically like, the sound rises, and we see that he basically sees the school itself as like a torture chamber or something. And then you can look at stuff like that really intoxicating piano scene, where Alex is playing the music and we're introduced to Eric and all that. Throws in some things, just little things here and there that could be reasons, but once again, you just never really know. Like, there is one thing that's interesting about the idea. I like the fact that Alex plays the piano, because it's like it sort of gives you this idea of like how meticulously his mind works, for better or worse. And then there's also the sketches that he's done, or that are just pinned up around the room, and that's where you start to kind of question where the title comes in, because there is a sketch of an elephant on the wall, and that's all we really get in regards to what the title is. But then it starts to make you think, is there significance to that? Like, when we see all the sketches on his walls, you'll notice that they're all like grouped together. There's like, 5 or 6 or whatever, just kind of in this almost collage of sketches or something. And then over here on this wall, but the elephant sketch is like just on a wall by itself. And it's like, is there a significance to that, to where it's like, could it have been what he was sketching when it just kind of went through his mind, that he could pull off something like this, or think he could, to where that's kind of where everything that had kind of snapped or switched over kind of manifested itself. Could it have been, is it even his sketch? Did somebody else do it? Did he do it for somebody? Or does it just not have any connotation to anything? It's really hard to say. Maybe the title comes from the fact that that's one of the points you can like analyze the most, is just that little sketch we see in that one panning shot where it just goes by and we never hear about it again, never look at it, never see it again. All that. And so when you look at all that, and then there's also the why of why bully Alex, because we don't know what's happened up to this point. All we see, the first shot of Alex we get, he's already being bullied, so there's no answer to that either. So that's the thing, is it's like, why really search for a reason when there's so many whys? Because there's just going to be an endless sea of whys, no matter what you come up with, just as it is in a real-life situation. And then that's when it comes into where it's like, is it really worth understanding? Well, from like a mental health perspective and getting more of a glimpse into that, yeah, it's probably worth understanding. But in the confines of this movie, it's just not really, like I said, there's just really no interest in finding out, because there's always going to be questions. And they even throw some stuff in there like the gaming. That could be Van Sant saying something about that, positive or negative. And it could be like, even if it is saying something, it doesn't feel like it's necessarily screaming it at us, because it's, what I take the video game scene as is foreshadowing. I don't necessarily think that Van Sant's trying to do the whole video games cause violence or anything like that. The movie's a lot more subtle than that. So I just kind of take that as, I guess even if it's foreshadowing, that's certainly not subtle either, but, yeah, I do think, I don't really take the video game scene in that direction, but I can totally see that being a talking point like that. So yeah, that's more or less what I get from this. If you want to be really bleak, like if you really, really want to be bleak, you can look at it as, this is a movie that could be saying, does anything matter? Because we get the moments when, like I said, everything in this movie up to that point is just a normal day with people having normal conversations that just ultimately come to this. Like, this has been their everyday since they started school, really. And it just comes to this so abruptly. Abruptly for them, maybe not for Alex and Eric, but abruptly for everybody else that just did not see this coming. And so it's like, little do those girls know that them talking about how cute Nathan is or whatever, and does he or does he not have a girlfriend, did she or did she not slap somebody in the hallway for looking at him, it doesn't matter, because this is how this day ends. And it's like the girl in the cafeteria they walk by that's, worried about her singing voice and the fact that she sang the Star-Spangled Banner so good, and it's like, little does she know that within minutes, there are guys with guns, like, coming into the school right at this very second, and within minutes she's going to be killed in the bathroom with those girls that just walked by her. And so that's like, now if you want to take it like that, you can be, you know, just a really bleak outlook on any, but you can also look at it as the whole kind of anything can happen approach, and just kind of a, I don't know if warning is the way I want to take this, but it does feel like it is basically saying in a very big way, um, these tiny moments, like just the way they could at any time be the last like this, has got to be something in there. But like I said, that's if you want to go really bleak, if you want to look at it as a does anything matter? Come to think of it, sort of thing. So yeah, that's pretty much what I take away from it. So that's where we're staying with that, and that's where Elephant's stance on death comes from with these other two movies. So now that that's been said, I think we can go on to the obviously Last Days, like I mentioned, was apparently it was actually going to be an actual Kurt Cobain biopic for a while there, like from the very start, that he was actually going to collaborate with Courtney Love on. But apparently it became kind of too much of an emotional process for her, despite the fact that they did like form a friendship. But overall, it just kind of became this thing, and he decided to just go ahead and make a fictional character that, once again, basically fits that, but is technically fictional. It even tells you that in the text at the very end after it's over. But yeah, and also if you're trying to piece together like who is what or whatever, I guess Asia Argento and Van Sant himself are very adamant that she is in no way supposed to represent Courtney Love whatsoever, which I can kind of get her presence in this isn't really that, you know, in the foreground, so that's pretty easy to buy. So we are sticking with a very similar feel to the other movies. Much like Elephant, most of the characters, with the exception of like Michael Pitt and Ricky Jay and a few others, all the characters, no matter how big or small, share names with their actor, the characters and the actors. And this is basically, we start off like we would the others, but the difference is that we kind of focus on just one person this time, as opposed to a group of people like an Elephant or two like in Gerry. So a lot of the beginning of the movie is just watching him. It's probably the first 15 minutes or so where we just kind of follow him around and see how he lives and all the interesting things that take place. Some of these things to where it's like, maybe this is how he lives, maybe since these are his last days, maybe, and he's getting a little more kind of on the downslope, that maybe some of these things aren't normal. Maybe these are firsts, like putting on a slip and toting a shotgun around and pointing it at your friends while they sleep. Maybe that's new, maybe it's not. But then there's stuff like just little weird touches, like he puts cereal in the refrigerator. I don't know if that's a normal thing, but it's almost like, what's weirder, putting cereal in the refrigerator or walking around in a slip with a shotgun? Either. And as we watch this, and it goes on, one of the more fascinating things about the movie is just the interactions that he has with other people. Like the Yellow Pages guy, for instance, which to my understanding was an actual dude that does that was actually looking to sell that to them on the movie set, and Van Sant was like, why don't you just do this for this character? And watching this scene, when he, like, as the guy just kind of does his job towards Michael Pitt playing this character, and he just, like, he takes off his coat at some point, he's still wearing the slip. At one point he smacks himself in the middle of it, and it's one of those cases where you kind of hope maybe they didn't tell the guy what Michael Pitt was going to do. I'm not sure if that's actually the case, given how movies are made. But it almost feels like it totally could be that. Everything feels like, in all three of these movies, everything feels so improv, despite the fact that they are apparently written, but it's hard, you can still kind of tell maybe some of that is in there. Especially in this scene. And then you get stuff like the Lucas Haas character talking about, like, he has this whole monologue about this girl that he had sex with, but it's like, not only did he have the scene with Scott prior to this, but just the way he talks about this girl, where it's like, you know, oh, we had sex, we had great sex, it was the best sex ever, and she had such a great body and all that. And like the more he goes on and the more he describes it, the more just clearly a lie this is, that he's really blowing out of proportion. Um, Trying to convince him to like write these lyrics for this song or whatever. Um, just little scenes like that. Then there's like the twins that try to talk about their church, and it's like, weirdly enough, these guys actually make it kind of interesting to listen. Like they somehow draw you in, despite the fact that normally you would be doing anything to avoid these guys talking to you. But I don't know if it's the way Van Sant shoots them or what exactly it is, but he just sort of makes every interaction feel interesting, regardless of how weird or small or potentially uninteresting it could be. And then we've got we got Harmony Korine towards the end there, the guy that he has like a very one-sided conversation about Dungeons and Dragons with. All these scenes are just kind of sprinkled throughout, and that's actually what makes up a large portion of the movie. But as you go on, there are certain kind of, I guess you could say, filmmaking techniques that feel very like... obviously, with movies like Gerry and Elephant, it seems like he's very much almost making it a point to go off the beaten path in regards to how these movies are presented and shown to the audience, and how they convey exactly what they're saying, and it can feel very, very unconventional. And this comes to mind especially in these scenes that may just mean nothing, but like the scene when Ricky Jay and the guy are driving, and he's talking about the bullet trick, which of course is funny because I say Ricky Jay is one of the few people that doesn't go by his real name in the movie, but Ricky Jay actually is a magician in real life, so to hear him telling the story of the magician still feels like it perfectly ties into him as an actual person. And as he's explaining this, and we got this long shot of them driving, you would typically, in a movie, it would just be a shot through the windshield of these two dudes talking, and that's all it would be. There'd be nothing to it. But Van Sant has made the interesting choice to have the trees above them reflecting off the windshield to where we can't even really see them. All we see is that reflection of the trees on the windshield as this conversation happens. And it's like this intentional defiance towards like tradition, like the way you traditionally shoot a scene, that's kind of really intriguing and almost feels like sort of rebellious in a way. It seems very simple, but that's just, every time I see it, that's kind of what I take away from it. And then also talking about going off the beaten path in regards to how the movie's made. There's also the famous anecdote about the dolly shot, when it's Michael Pitt performing and we're watching it through the window and it's pulling back. And to my understanding, the way it was that they only had 3 pieces of the track, and as they were pulling it back, they had to like take them from the front and put them back and basically do this like a fucking cartoon or something in order to get the camera to go back as far as they wanted it to. Apparently it took like 7 tries or something. And just stuff like that makes it feel like you look at Van Sant and this, just how established he is at this point, and the fact that he could still make a movie like this, almost like something somebody would have to do if they were just making a movie in their backyard with no experience. And that does come through in especially these movies and Last Days particularly. So that's always something really nice. I do have a lot more problems with Last Days than I do Gerry or Elephant, obviously. Because starting with one scene I never really bought, that scene I was talking about with Lucas Oz and Scott. I have heard before Van Sant be accused of like shoehorning in kind of a gay aspect, sort of like the shower scene in Elephant. But it doesn't feel shoehorned in at all in Elephant. It's very much like they do very much set that up with Eric saying the whole, I've never kissed anybody and all that stuff. And it's like maybe they have that relationship, and maybe it was just, well, we feel we're about to die, might as well do this. And it felt like it was in place. I don't know that I can say the same about the Lucas Oz and Scott scene in this, when they're like making out on the bed, which may or may not have gone to something else we don't really see. But it did feel like I said, especially since it's a movie that's centered around one person, it felt very much like kind of a detour that just felt really unnecessary and like kind of dragged out the runtime a little more than it should have. Um, which is a really dangerous thing to do in a movie that's as seemingly aimless as Last Days is. And that's the thing about that too, is in Jerry and Elephant, we know in all the movies we know that the inevitable will come, but in Jerry and Elephant we can feel it almost throughout, and like even the most meandering scenes feel driven by us knowing what the inevitable is. But the thing is that Last Days a lot of the time does feel just kind of aimless without that. And yeah, you could say, of course, that's, perfectly mirrors his aimless existence, sure. But the problem is that we don't really, at least me anyway, I don't really feel that. And it's like you kind of need to feel that in him throughout the movie and not just feel like you're kind of watching a stranger from a distance. Because it's like in Elephant, there are people that feel real, and they feel like people you might know, people you might have actually gone to school with. In Jerry, the situation, surreal as it is, almost feels like you can imagine yourself in that situation, and you can feel that hopelessness when you watch Jerry. That's something that's missing from Last Days, I think. And that's through no fault of Michael Pitt, by the way. He's very effective. He makes the character feel very lived in. There's something very discomforting about watching him, but at the same time you can't look away. And that's the power of what Michael Pitt can do. But it's like maybe it does have something to do with the fact that Jerry feels like it centers around a whole situation, and Elephant feels like it centers around a whole group of people on top of a situation. And Last Days just kind of is the one person. I mean, obviously there are things in the background, there are other characters, obviously there's the whole real life angle. It's the one that's like most upfront about the real life inspiration. But yeah, it just really feels like there's something in these two movies that's missing from this, and it doesn't feel driven by that whole coming to an inevitable conclusion thing, and it doesn't make you feel like you're really in the situation. It feels so much more distant than Jerry and Elephant. Once again, some people might see that as totally appropriate for a character like this and a story like this, but for me it just kind of sticks out a little bit when you look at the rest of the trilogy as a whole, especially as a closing piece. So yeah, and that's basically how I feel about that. But it's definitely worth it when you go through the whole trilogy. It's certainly worth looking into, and it's worth checking out. So just the whole thing, there's I'm sure plenty of talking points, especially if you are much more up to speed on what Cobain's life was or supposedly was. It might fascinate you more. So yeah, so overall, that's what we have here. Obviously a very impressive trilogy from a very creative and, you could probably say daring filmmaker. Actually, you probably certainly can, because the great thing that Van Sant does here that I was talking about was he had already really established himself in a number of ways. Like, he had, the smaller hits that certain audiences really went for, like My Own Private Idaho and Drugstore Cowboy and stuff like that. But then he got, really mainstream with stuff like To Die For kind of got him there, and then, of course, Good Will Hunting happened. Say what you will about the Psycho remake, but that's about as mainstream as you can get. And then to be able to go back to this territory, but then also later on to be able to do the big Oscar-nominated biopics like Milk. Just like he's such a word I heard used to describe Van Sant recently was shapeshifter. That's a really good word to describe Gus Van Sant and his style, and his filmography. So he's definitely a director I really appreciate, even if not all of his movies hit at all. Like that one with Mia Wasikowska, what was it, like Restless? Like some of them just feel very just blank and not that great, but yeah, obviously most of these were scripted by him. The only one that wasn't solely scripted by him was Jerry, where Affleck and Damon got writing credits. But once again, it's really hard to tell what even is written, which makes the trilogy all the more special among all the other stuff I've mentioned. So, I think that's about all I have to say about these. Hopefully this wasn't too intelligence insulting or whatever. If this interested you, I am doing another trilogy in a couple of weeks, the Hal Hartley Henry Fool trilogy. So we're gonna do that. And in between, we got one coming up as well. So until all that stuff, we've also got it's like sequels in regards to what's coming out in theaters over the next 3 weeks. So we'll have that to look forward to and all that stuff all the way into July. So until all that stuff, I